For our next test, we're going to do something a little bit fancier. I want to be able to instantiate a SQL repository. And the trick here is that the SQL repository doesn't have a default constructor. It has a constructor that actually requires another dependency that the container knows about. It requires an iLogger. So let's write a test for this and see how I can get it to work. I'll start off just by copying this test and change the name. So I want to resolve types without default constructors. That is essentially what I want to do. I'll add an additional piece of configuration here that says for the type iRepository of employee, I want you to use a SQL repository of employee. And then I would expect if I asked the container to resolve an iRepository of employee and put that in a variable repository and actually use the correct number of brackets here, I would expect that if I asked the repository about its type, that it would come back and tell me it is actually a SQL repository of employee. Let's run the test and see what happens. And of course, that one's going to fail. And the error is going to be related to not being able to find a parameterless constructor. Because inside of the container, when we use activator.createInstance, we're assuming there's a default constructor, when in reality, what we're going to need to do in this situation is use the createInstance version that allows us to pass along constructor parameters. And that means we need to figure out what constructor to call and what parameters to pass into it, which also means this activation logic is going to be a little bit trickier. So I'm going to highlight this line of code, hit Control-RM, and extract a method called createInstance. And inside of createInstance, we can factor in this additional logic that we need. So first of all, createInstance, I don't want this to be static. But what it's going to have to do is look at this destination type and figure out, first of all, what constructors are available. So let me create a variable. I'll just call it Q for right now, where I say, dear destination type, using reflection, give me a list of your constructors. Because there could be multiple constructors. The constructor could be overloaded. And it's at this point where a fully featured inversion of control container would have some sort of strategy for selecting the proper constructor. Some containers like structure map, they always pick the constructor that has the most number of parameters. So that would be something like order by descending. For each constructor, C goes to C dot get parameters and count those parameters. So that would be one way of, if there's multiple constructors to find the constructor that has the most parameters. I'm going to leave that in there and say that once we've ordered this, we'll just take the first one. Now, a word of warning about that line of code. Someone might have given us a type that doesn't have any constructors available, because this will only be looking for public constructors. And this first could throw an exception if it doesn't find any constructors available. But again, for this simple demo, I'm not going to include all of the error handling code and edge cases that you would need in a fully featured container. That's why we just use ones that are already built. But given that constructor, I want to get the parameters that are available for that constructor. And you can see this is just coming out to be one big link statement. And now getParameters will return an array of parameter info. Parameter info is another class in system.reflection that can tell you information about a parameter like its type. And now what I need to do is for each parameter that I've found, I need to change that parameter from type information into an actual instance. And it could be that that parameter type is something else that the container knows about. For instance, that parameter type in the case of a SQL repository is an iLogger. So basically I need to do a transformation, a projection, to say that for each parameter, let's call back into the container, into ourselves, to resolve that parameter type. And if the container can create an instance, that now means instead of a sequence of parameter info, I now have a sequence of objects that represent the parameters I need to pass to the constructor. And because createInstance requires an array of those objects, I'll finish off this query with a toArray. I can call this parameters, and I can pass parameters as the second parameter to activator.createInstance. And now let's run the test again. And we'll see that we now have 2 passing tests, which is quite wonderful, because now we can construct an object like SQL repository, where SQL repository itself requires another dependency, an iLogger, but our inversion of control container can just stitch all these things together for us. But we're not quite finished. I want to look at one more scenario, introduce just a little more complexity, a specific scenario that uses some more generic type information.